The crimson sky of Zirian Prime burned with the light of 3 dying suns as Queen Zarathex collapsed against the twisted metal of her destroyed command ship. Purple blood seeped from the gaping wound in her chest where the assassin's energy blade had found its mark. Each breath sent waves of agony through her 4-chambered heart, and she could feel her life force ebbing away like water through cracked stone. Around her, the remains of her once mighty fleet lay scattered across the barren landscape like broken toys. The Kethmori invasion had been swift and merciless. Her people, the proud Velthari, had ruled this sector of the galaxy for over 10,000 years. Their crystalline cities had sparkled like jewels among the stars. Their technology had been the envy of countless civilizations, and their wisdom had brought peace to hundreds of worlds. Now, in the span of a single solar cycle, it was all burning. The queen tried to move, but her 6 limbs refused to obey. The neural toxin from the blade was spreading through her system, shutting down her motor functions one by one. She had perhaps minutes before the poison reached her brain's stem and ended her suffering forever. Part of her welcomed the thought. At least in death, she would not have to witness the complete destruction of everything she had sworn to protect. Through the smoke and debris, she could hear the heavy footsteps of Kethmori shock troopers advancing across the battlefield. Their guttural war chants echoed off the canyon walls, a sound that had struck fear into the hearts of prey species across the galaxy for millennia. The Kethmori were everything the Velthari were not: brutal, savage, and utterly without mercy. They did not conquer worlds to rule them. They consumed them, leaving nothing but ash and silence in their wake. Queen Zarathex had been a fool to think her people could stand against them. The Kethmori had swept through the outer colonies like a plague, their bioships adapting to every defense her military could devise. When the final battle came to Zirian Prime, she had led the defense personally, hoping to inspire her troops to one last heroic stand. Instead, she had watched helplessly as her greatest warriors were slaughtered before her eyes. The assassin who had struck her down still lay nearby, his own body torn apart by her royal guard's final desperate counterattack. Even dying, the creature's insectoid face was twisted in an expression of savage joy. The Kethmori lived for war and death, and this one had achieved the greatest prize of all, the life of a galactic sovereign. As her vision began to fade, Queen Zarathex thought of her daughter, Princess Lyrashan, who had escaped with the last evacuation ships. At least some of her people would survive, scattered to the far reaches of space. Perhaps, in time, they could rebuild. Perhaps they could find new worlds, new hope. It was a small comfort, but it was all she had left. The footsteps were getting closer now. Soon, the Kethmori would find her body and claim their trophy. They would probably mount her head in their war shrine, another testament to their unstoppable might. The thought filled her with rage, but there was nothing she could do. Her strength was gone, her weapons lost, her people defeated. That was when she heard something impossible, the whine of atmospheric engines, growing louder by the second. She forced her failing eyes to focus on the sky above, expecting to see another wave of Kethmori assault craft coming to finish the job. Instead, what she saw made her question whether the toxin was causing hallucinations. A small, primitive-looking vessel was descending through the smoke clouds, its hull scarred and patched like it had seen 1,000 battles. The design was unlike anything in her extensive knowledge of galactic civilizations, crude by Velthari standards, but somehow radiating an aura of stubborn durability. As it touched down barely 50 meters away, she caught sight of strange markings on its side. Text in a script she had never seen before, accompanied by what appeared to be a stylized representation of a blue and green world. The ship's cargo ramp lowered with a grinding of poorly maintained hydraulics, and a figure emerged into the hellish landscape. Queen Zarathex's eyes widened in disbelief. The being was bipedal, like herself, but smaller and far more fragile-looking. Its skin was a pale pinkish tone, and it wore armor that seemed cobbled together from a dozen different sources. Most shocking of all, it appeared to have only 2 arms and 2 legs, a body configuration so limited that the Queen wondered how such a species could have achieved spaceflight. The strange being spotted her immediately and began running toward her position, apparently oblivious to the danger posed by the approaching Kethmori forces. As it drew closer, she could see its face clearly for the first time. The features were oddly symmetrical, with two forward-facing eyes that burned with an intensity she recognized, the look of a warrior who had seen too much death and refused to accept one more. "Hey there," the being called out in accented galactic standard, its voice carrying surprising warmth despite the dire circumstances. "Looks like you're having a really bad day. Name's Marcus Chun, and I'm what you might call a professional problem solver." Queen Zarathex tried to respond, but only managed a weak gurgle as more blood filled her throat. The being, Marcus, apparently, knelt beside her and began examining her wounds with practiced efficiency. His hands moved with surprising gentleness as he assessed her injuries, and she found herself oddly comforted by his presence. "Yeah, this is bad," he muttered, pulling what appeared to be a medical scanner from his belt. "Neural toxin, energy weapon trauma, and you're losing blood fast. But I've seen worse, and I've got some tricks up my sleeve." He looked directly into her eyes, and she was startled by the fierce determination she saw there. "Just hang on, Your Majesty. Marcus Chin doesn't let royalty die on his watch." The Kethmori war chants were getting louder, and she could see the first of the shock troopers cresting the ridge above them. This strange human warrior had perhaps minutes before he would be facing a force that had destroyed her entire civilization. Yet he seemed completely focused on her injuries, as if the approaching army was merely a minor inconvenience. Queen Zarathex had ruled for 3 centuries and thought she understood every species in the galaxy. But as Marcus Chun worked to save her life while death itself closed in around them, she realized she had never encountered anything quite like humanity. Marcus Chin's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon as he injected a cocktail of human-designed medical nanobots into Queen Zarathex's bloodstream. The tiny machines immediately began working to neutralize the Kethmori toxin and seal her internal bleeding. It was experimental tech, barely tested on alien physiology, but it was the only chance she had. "These little guys are programmed to adapt," he explained while working, his voice calm despite the thundering approach of enemy forces. "Human immune systems are weird. We evolved on a death world where everything wanted to kill us, so we got really good at not dying. Our medical tech reflects that philosophy." The Queen tried to speak, but Marcus gently pressed a finger to her lips. "Save your strength. The nanobots need about 10 minutes to stabilize you, and we're about to have company." As if summoned by his words, the first Kethmori shock trooper appeared over the ridge. The creature stood nearly 3 meters tall, its exoskeleton gleaming black in the dying light. Multiple arms ended in razor-sharp claws, and its mouth was filled with rows of serrated teeth designed for tearing flesh. It spotted them immediately and let out a bone-chilling roar that was answered by dozens of its companions. Marcus stood up slowly, checking his weapons with methodical care. His rifle was a battered thing that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, and his sidearm appeared to be held together with tape and stubborn determination. To Queen Zarathex's alien eyes, he looked pathetically outgunned. "So here's the thing about humans," Marcus said conversationally, never taking his eyes off the approaching horde. "We're not the strongest, we're not the fastest, and we're definitely not the smartest species in the galaxy. But we have one trait that makes up for all of that. We're absolutely terrible at knowing when to quit." The Kethmori charged down the slope in a wave of chittering fury. Their bioweapons began firing, sending streams of acidic projectiles toward the small human figure. Marcus waited until the last possible second, then dove to the side, rolling behind the wreckage of a Velthari fighter craft. The Queen watched in amazement as the human began a running battle among the debris field. He moved like liquid lightning, using every piece of cover, every shadow, every scrap of twisted metal to his advantage. His weapons fired with precise, economical bursts, never wasting ammunition, never missing critical shots. When his rifle ran dry, he seamlessly switched to his sidearm. When that was empty, he pulled grenades from his belt and began hurling them with deadly accuracy. But for every Kethmori he dropped, 3 more took its place. The Queen could see the inevitable mathematics of the battle. Marcus was skilled beyond measure, but he was one being against an army. Even his superhuman determination couldn't overcome such odds indefinitely. That was when she witnessed something that defied all logic and tactical doctrine. Instead of retreating to a defensible position, Marcus began advancing toward the enemy. He sprinted from cover to cover, getting closer to the main body of Kethmori forces with each bound. It was tactical suicide, and it was absolutely magnificent. "You want to know what humans call this?" He shouted over the din of battle, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "We call it a target-rich environment." He pulled something from his backpack that made the Queen's blood run cold. A fusion charge, military grade, with enough explosive power to level several city blocks. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't trying to win this battle. He was trying to buy her time, and he was willing to pay any price to do it. The Kethmori seemed to sense the shift in the humans' tactics. Their advance faltered as they tried to understand why their prey was now hunting them. In their species' long and bloody history, they had never encountered anything quite like this. A creature that fought harder when cornered, that became more dangerous as the odds against it grew worse. Marcus reached the center of the Kethmori formation and activated the charge's timer. The aliens finally understood what he was planning and began fleeing in all directions, their disciplined assault dissolving into panicked chaos. But Marcus wasn't finished with his surprises. He pulled out what looked like a simple metal rod and pressed a button on its side. Instantly, the device expanded into a full-sized energy sword that hummed with barely contained power. It was a weapon that belonged to a much more advanced civilization than anything Earth was supposed to possess. "Souvenir from my last job," he called out cheerfully, as if he was discussing the weather instead of facing certain death. "The Andromedans make excellent hardware, even if their coffee tastes like motor oil." What followed was a display of swordsmanship that bordered on the artistic. Marcus moved through the Kethmori ranks like a force of nature, his blade cutting through their natural armor as if it were tissue paper. The aliens, for all their ferocity, had never faced a human warrior in full battle rage. They had conquered countless civilizations through superior numbers and savage brutality, but they had no answer for this new kind of fury, cold, calculated, and absolutely relentless. Queen Zarethex felt strength returning to her limbs as the nanobots completed their work. The toxin was neutralized, her wounds were sealed, and her major organs were functioning again. She could move, she could fight, but she found herself transfixed by the impossible scene playing out before her. This human warrior was buying her life with his own, and he was doing it with a smile on his face. When a Kethmori acid spitter caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, he simply adjusted his grip on his sword and kept fighting. When another managed to score deep claw marks across his back, he turned the motion into an elegant riposte that dropped 3 enemies at once. But even legends have their limits. Marcus was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his movements were slowing, and the fusion charge was counting down its final seconds. The Kethmori had regrouped and were pressing in from all sides, their superior numbers finally beginning to tell. The Queen struggled to her feet, her royal training demanding that she stand and face death with dignity. If this brave human could sacrifice everything for a stranger, then she could at least die beside him instead of cowering on the ground like a wounded animal. Marcus caught sight of her movement and shook his head firmly. "Stay down, Your Majesty. The nanobots aren't finished yet, and I've still got this handled." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was the kind of lie that made heroes, the kind that inspired legends, the kind that gave meaning to sacrifice. As the fusion charge entered its final countdown, and the Kethmori closed in for the kill, Queen Zarethex finally understood what made humans so unique in the galaxy. It wasn't their technology or their tactics or their stubborn refusal to surrender. It was their absolute inability to let others suffer alone. The fusion charge reached 0, and for a moment, the battlefield was consumed by a miniature star. The explosion vaporized the nearest Kethmori soldiers instantly and sent the rest tumbling like leaves in a hurricane. When the light faded and the smoke cleared, Queen Zarethex expected to see nothing but a smoking crater where Marcus Chun had made his final stand. Instead, She watched in disbelief as the human emerged from behind a massive piece of debris, his armor smoking but his energy sword still crackling with power. He had somehow managed to reach cover in the split second before detonation, using the explosion's own force to eliminate a significant portion of his enemies. That's what we call aggressive problem-solving, Marcus called out, wiping blood from his eyes with the back of his hand. The blast had bought them perhaps 5 minutes before more Kethmori reinforcements arrived, and he intended to make every second count. He jogged back to where the queen lay, his movements still fluid despite his obvious injuries. Up close, she could see the full extent of the damage he had sustained. Burns covered half his face, his left arm hung at an odd angle, and there were deep puncture wounds in his chest that should have been fatal. Yet he moved as if these were minor inconveniences rather than life-threatening trauma. Human physiology, he explained, noticing her stare. We're basically biological shock troops, designed by evolution's cruelest sense of humor. Takes a lot more than this to put us down permanently. He knelt beside her and checked his medical scanner. The nanobots had done their work well. Her vital signs were stabilizing rapidly, and the neural pathways were re-establishing proper function. But she was still far from combat ready, and they both knew it. Listen carefully, Marcus said, his voice taking on a serious tone for the first time since his arrival. I've got one more trick up my sleeve, but it's going to require some trust on your part. My ship has an emergency beacon. It'll bring help, but not the kind you might expect. Before the queen could ask what he meant, the ground began to shake with the approach of heavy Kethmori war machines. Through the smoke, she could make out the distinctive silhouettes of biotanks, living weapons that could level buildings with their organic cannons. Marcus had fought brilliantly against infantry, but these new arrivals would require firepower he simply didn't possess. Marcus activated something on his wrist communicator and spoke in what sounded like his native language, a rapid, melodic tongue that somehow conveyed urgency and determination in equal measure. When he finished, he looked up at the approaching tanks with an expression that might have been satisfaction. You know what's funny about humans? He asked, standing up and checking his remaining weapons. Everyone assumes we're individualists because we're so scattered across the galaxy. Truth is, we're pack hunters from way back. Lone wolves are a myth. Real wolves hunt in coordinated groups, and so do we. As if summoned by his words, the sky began to fill with contrails. Dozens of small craft were entering the atmosphere at combat speed, their engines screaming as they dove toward the battlefield. The Queen recognized some of the designs: mercenary vessels, salvage ships, even converted cargo haulers. But what struck her was how they moved together with perfect coordination despite their mismatched appearance. "Who are they?" she managed to ask, her voice still weak, but growing stronger. "Human Preservation Corps," Marcus replied, his battered face splitting into a fierce grin. "We're not technically military, since Earth doesn't have a formal fleet anymore. We're more like concerned citizens who happen to be really good at violence." The first wave of human ships opened fire on the Kethmori war machines, their weapons displaying a bewildering variety of technologies. Some fired conventional projectiles, others used energy beams, and a few unleashed weapons that seemed to bend the laws of physics entirely. The biotanks, caught completely off guard by this aerial assault, began exploding in spectacular displays of organic fireworks. But the humans weren't content to simply provide air support. Landing craft began touching down around the battlefield, disgorging teams of warriors who looked remarkably similar to Marcus. Battle-scarred, heavily armed, and completely unimpressed by the reputation of their enemies. Queen Zarathex watched in amazement as the tide of battle shifted dramatically. The Kethmori, who had seemed unstoppable minutes before, found themselves facing an enemy that fought with a coordination they had never encountered. Human teams moved like dancers, each member knowing exactly where their companions would be at any given moment. When one warrior fell, 2 others immediately moved to cover their position. When ammunition ran low, supplies appeared as if by magic from the omnipresent support network. "How is this possible?" the Queen asked, struggling to understand what she was witnessing. "Your species isn't even listed in the Galactic military databases." Marcus helped her to her feet as a human medic approached with more advanced healing equipment. That's because we don't fight like traditional military forces. See, most galactic civilizations developed in relatively peaceful environments. They built their military doctrines around territorial disputes and resource conflicts, basically organized competitions with rules and objectives. He gestured toward the battlefield, where human warriors were systematically dismantling Kethmori positions with ruthless efficiency. We evolved on a planet where everything bigger than us wanted to eat us, everything smaller than us was poisonous, and the weather tried to kill us on a regular basis. We didn't develop military doctrine. We developed survival instinct raised to an art form. The medic reached them and immediately began treating both patients. The queen was surprised to note that the human showed genuine concern for her welfare, even though she was obviously an alien. Most species would prioritize their own wounded over strangers, but this human seemed to consider her condition equally important to Marcus's injuries. "Ma'am, I'm Corpsman Rodriguez," the medic said in perfect galactic standard. "I need to run some compatibility tests before we can use our advanced healing tech on you." But the nanobots seemed to be doing their job beautifully. Whoever designed them really knew their stuff. Marcus accepted the medic's attention with obvious reluctance, clearly preferring to remain focused on the battle. But even as Rodriguez worked on his wounds, his eyes never left the tactical display on his wrist communicator. The queen realized that despite his injuries and obvious exhaustion, Marcus was still commanding the human forces through some form of quantum-encrypted communication network. "Status report," he said into his comm unit. A dozen voices responded simultaneously, each providing precise updates on ammunition, casualties, and tactical position. The queen listened in fascination as Marcus absorbed all this information and began issuing new orders. He was coordinating a three-dimensional battle involving air support, ground forces, and what appeared to be orbital artillery, all while receiving medical treatment for wounds that should have incapacitated him. "Sir, we've got Kethmori reinforcements incoming from Sectors 7 and 12, one voice reported. "Looks like they're bringing everything they've got left." Marcus studied his tactical display for a moment, then smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Perfect. Signal the fleet. It's time for the human welcome wagon." High above them, the queen could see new shapes moving against the stars. They were larger than the first wave of ships, and they moved with the ponderous grace of heavy warships. As they descended through the atmosphere, she could make out details that made her question everything she thought she knew about human technology. These weren't the cobbled-together vessels of mercenaries and adventurers. These were purpose-built warships that radiated the kind of quiet menace that came only from superior engineering and absolute confidence in their capabilities. And they were all flying the same insignia, the blue and green world she had seen on Marcus's small ship, surrounded by symbols that could only represent humanity's scattered colonies throughout the galaxy. The human fleet descended like avenging angels, their weapons systems charging with a harmonious hum that seemed to resonate through the very bedrock of Zirian Prime. Queen Zarathex counted at least 50 warships, each one unique in design, yet somehow perfectly integrated into a unified force. It was as if humanity had taken the concept of military doctrine and completely rewritten it from first principles. "Flagship Indomitable to ground control." A crisp voice came through Marcus's communicator. "We have visual confirmation of Kethmori fleet elements in high orbit. Requesting permission to engage." Marcus glanced at the queen, and she was surprised to see him hesitate. Despite everything that had happened, despite the fact that her own forces had been completely destroyed, he was still treating her as the legitimate authority on her homeworld. "Your Majesty," he said formally, "this is your world, and your people we're fighting to protect. The call should be yours." Queen Zarathex felt a surge of emotion that had nothing to do with her injuries. In all her centuries of rule, no foreign commander had ever shown such respect for her sovereignty. Most would have simply taken control and explained their actions later. But this human warrior, who had already risked everything to save her life, was still asking for her permission to help. "Engage all hostile forces," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of 10,000 years of Velthuri royalty. "Drive these invaders from my system." Marcus smiled and relayed the order. "All ships, you are authorized to engage." Rules of engagement are weapons free. Show these bug-eyed bastards why humanity doesn't play nice with slavers. What followed was a masterclass in three-dimensional warfare. The human ships didn't simply attack the Kethmori forces. They dismantled them with surgical precision. Each vessel seemed to know exactly where its companions would be at any given moment, allowing them to execute complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for conventional fleets. The Queen watched in fascination as a group of human destroyers performed what could only be called a synchronized dance around a massive Kethmori biocruiser. They darted in and out of its firing arcs like swimmers navigating a reef, each ship taking turns to strike at carefully selected weak points. Within minutes, the kilometer-long alien vessel was breaking apart, its organic systems failing in cascading sequences. How do they coordinate so perfectly? She asked, unable to keep the awe from her voice. Neural linking, Marcus explained, accepting a fresh weapon from one of his troops. Every human ship has at least one crew member with quantum-enhanced cognitive abilities. They can share tactical information instantaneously across vast distances. It's like having a single mind controlling dozens of bodies. The explanation raised even more questions, but before the Queen could ask them, a new threat emerged from the smoke clouds above the battlefield. A Kethmori command dreadnought, easily 3 times the size of the largest human warship, began descending toward the surface. Its bioweapons were already charging, preparing to glass the entire continent rather than risk defeat. Now that's what I call a target, Marcus said cheerfully, though the Queen could hear the concern underlying his casual tone. Even with all their advantages, the humans were facing a vessel that could single-handedly destroy entire fleets. Flagship indomitable to all units. The same crisp voice came through the communicator. We have a big bug incoming. Initiate Omega Protocol. Repeat, Omega Protocol is authorized. The Queen had no idea what Omega Protocol meant, but the reaction from the human forces was immediate and dramatic. Every ship in the fleet suddenly changed course, moving into a complex formation that seemed to focus on a single point in space directly above the descending dreadnought. You might want to close your eyes for this part, Your Majesty, Marcus suggested. Human superweapons tend to be a bit flashy. Before she could ask what he meant, the space above them erupted in light. But this wasn't the chaotic explosion of conventional weapons. It was something far more controlled and infinitely more terrifying. The human ships had somehow created what appeared to be an artificial star, a miniature fusion reaction contained within a magnetic bottle and directed at their target with pinpoint accuracy. The Kethmori dreadnought, for all its massive bulk and adaptive armor, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, threatening to destroy everything on the planet's surface. The next moment, there was nothing but expanding plasma and the lingering afterimage of forces beyond the Queen's comprehension. Stellar compression cannon, Marcus explained casually, as if he was discussing the weather. We borrowed the basic theory from a species in the Andromeda galaxy and made a few improvements. Turns out that if you can compress a star's worth of matter into a space the size of a pinhead, you can use it to solve most tactical problems. The Queen stared at him in disbelief. You're telling me that humans have developed star-killer weapons, and you're using them as conventional ship-to-ship armaments? Well, we prefer to think of them as aggressive negotiating tools, Marcus replied with a grin. Amazing how much more reasonable people become when you can demonstrate the power to delete solar systems on demand. The rest of the Kethmori forces, apparently having reached the same conclusion, began fleeing the system as quickly as their bioships could manage. The Queen watched as vessel after vessel engaged their faster-than-light drives and vanished into hyperspace, abandoning their conquest in the face of humanity's impossible firepower. Within the span of an hour, a force that had seemed utterly unstoppable had been not just defeated but completely routed. The scattered remnants of her own fleet were already regrouping under human protection, and rescue ships were descending to collect survivors from the planetary surface. How many of my people survived? She asked, dreading the answer. Marcus consulted his tactical display. Looks like about 60% of your population made it to the evacuation ships before the Kethmori reached the cities. Your military managed to save about 30% of their forces by conducting fighting retreats rather than trying to hold fixed positions. All things considered, it could have been much worse. The queen felt tears forming in her eyes, tears of grief for the dead, but also tears of relief for the living. Her civilization was wounded, perhaps crippled, but it was not destroyed. Thanks to this strange human warrior and his impossible fleet, her people would survive to rebuild. Why? She asked, the question bursting out before she could stop herself. Why did you risk everything for a species you'd never met before? What could you possibly gain from this? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his expression becoming uncharacteristically serious. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Because that's what humans do, Your Majesty. We see someone in trouble, and we can't just walk away. It's not about profit or politics or strategic advantage. It's about the simple fact that we refuse to live in a universe where the strong are allowed to prey on the weak without consequence. He gestured toward the human ships that were now coordinating the massive rescue operation with military efficiency. Every person in this fleet has a story about someone who helped them when they needed it most. Maybe it was another human. Maybe it was an alien stranger. But someone chose to care when they could have looked the other way. Today, we get to pass that kindness forward. The Queen looked around at the bustling activity of the rescue operation, at the human medics treating Veltheri wounded with the same care they showed their own people, at the engineers already beginning to salvage her people's technology and resources. This wasn't conquest disguised as liberation. This was genuine compassion backed by overwhelming force. For the first time in her long life, Queen Zarethex began to understand why the galaxy's ancient prophecies spoke of a species that would someday emerge from the darkness between stars to reshape the balance of power forever. She had always assumed those prophecies referred to some advanced alien civilization with superior technology and wisdom. She had never imagined they might be talking about a bunch of persistent, stubborn, impossible humans who simply refused to let evil triumph on their watch. 3 days after the battle, Queen Zarethex stood in what had once been the royal gardens of her palace, now converted into a temporary command center for the massive humanitarian operation. Human engineers worked alongside Veltheri technicians to restore basic infrastructure, while medical teams from a dozen different ships treated refugees in hastily constructed field hospitals. The scale of the human response had been staggering. Within hours of the Kethmori retreat, supply ships began arriving from across known space, carrying everything from basic medical supplies to advanced terraforming equipment. It was as if the entire human diaspora had mobilized at once, dropping whatever they were doing to assist complete strangers. It's remarkable, she said to Marcus, who was reviewing casualty reports at a portable workstation. His own injuries had been largely healed by human medical technology, though he still moved carefully and bore several impressive scars. Your people have no governmental structure, no central authority, yet they coordinate relief efforts better than most galactic empires. Marcus looked up from his tablet, his expression thoughtful. That's because we don't coordinate from the top down. Every human ship captain, colony leader, and wandering mercenary knows the basic protocols. When someone sends out a distress call, you drop whatever you're doing and you help. It's not law or regulation. It's just how we're wired as a species. The Queen had been studying human behavior for 3 days now, and she was beginning to understand that their apparent chaos masked a deeper order. They argued constantly, questioned authority reflexively, and seemed to delight in making their leaders' lives difficult. Yet when crisis struck, they moved with the unified purpose of a hive mind. There's something I need to tell you, Marcus said, his tone becoming serious. Something you're not going to like. The Queen felt her heart skip a beat. Over the past few days, she had come to trust this human warrior implicitly. If he was concerned about something, it was worth her immediate attention. The Kethmori didn't retreat, Marcus continued. They regrouped. Our long-range scouts have detected a massive fleet buildup in the void reaches, easily 10 times the size of the force that hit your homeworld. They're calling in every war clan, every bio ship, every weapon they've got. The implications hit the Queen like a physical blow. They mean to come back. Worse than that, Marcus said grimly. They're calling it a crusade. According to the intelligence we've gathered, they see humanity as an existential threat to their way of life. They've never encountered a species that could match their military capabilities while maintaining what they consider soft values like mercy and compassion. He stood up and walked to a tactical display showing the current disposition of forces throughout the sector. The Kethmori believe that if we're allowed to exist, we'll eventually convince other species to adopt our weakness. They're coming to wipe out every human colony, every allied species, every trace of our influence in this part of the galaxy. Queen Zarathex studied the display, her trained military mind quickly grasping the strategic implications. How many ships do you have available to defend against such a force? About 1,000 combat vessels scattered across 12 systems, Marcus replied. All volunteer crews, all independently operated. If we try to gather them into a single fleet, it'll take weeks, and leave our colonies defenseless in the meantime. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, processing the scale of the threat. Then, she asked the question that had been troubling her since the battle. Marcus, how many humans are there? Your people seem to be everywhere, but I've never seen demographic.